Hi, welcome to D365 Shop First. My name's Phil Kermeen. I'm a technical architect at FormusPro. This is my colleague.
I'm Charlie Rodgers. I'm an ex-construction worker, BC consultant now. Just transitioned into the industry. So
Right.
nice to meet you, Phil.
Nice to meet you. We have been working together for a while. This is our first time at this podcast, so it's a little bit of fun getting used to how we're putting this all together. So,
Episode 1.
Episode 1. So what are we going to talk about today?
Well, I'd like to talk a bit about integrations, BC. What is BC? What is CE?
So BC is Business Central.
Business Central, D365 Business Central.
Okay.
It's a ERP solution. What is
ERP.
customer engagement?
What is ERP? You call it customer engagement, and I call it CE. So, which used to be called CRM. So this is a product that's been around for a long time. Microsoft Dynamics CRM as it used to be. And what happened to it is that Microsoft over the years have improved it, added bits and pieces, taken bits and pieces away, and it's now called basically the Power Platform. And that's got a whole bunch of things that sit on top of it. Customer experience is sometimes what it's called, but it's now really a whole bunch of different products that sit on top of this Power Platform. So Business Central, does that run on the Power Platform?
Well, sort of. There's Power Automate that we use. That's in the Power Platform. It's very much integrated with CE.
Okay.
Or with BC, rather. BC is also one of those things, formerly Navision. Microsoft have bought out,
That's right.
upgraded, improved, and we've just slowly moved on. And now it is D365 BC.
Wow.
Did you know at some point they were going to sack off BC and retire the product?
Really?
Yeah. And now,
it seems to be going great guns. I mean, it's one of the three pillars, I guess, of the Dynamics sort of product suite.
it is. In my head, the three products are CE, FinOps, and BC.
Right. So FinOps, F&O, sometimes called F&O. So, and in terms of order or strength, where do you think you'd put these?
I think CE is probably, most people when we go to these events and, me and yourself included, went to Dynamic Minds.
We did.
I've been to South Coast Summit. Have you been to South Coast Summit?
I've been to South Coast Summit a couple of times.
Scottish Summit?
No, but I'm going this year, even though it's going to be very cold and probably raining or something like that, which is not like Dynamics Minds, which was warm and lovely.
Yeah, Dynamic Minds was
fantastic, wasn't it?
If I can advocate anyone to go to any event.
Absolutely.
Dynamic
Slovenia,
Minds.
Full stop, really, was lovely, wasn't it?
Other than the travel.
Yeah, the travel's a little bit, but 2 hours with you in a little taxi cuddled together was beautiful.
Catching up on sleep.
Catching up on sleep, snoring on my shoulder. No, it's fine. What are we talking about? So we were going to talk a little bit more about CE. So we explained what that is. Customer engagement, Power Platform. So it's it's quite a beast now. It's quite a beast. It's grown. So we mentioned CRM, and we mentioned that they spun out the engine for CRM, and they called it the Power Platform. And then they took all the little components that were part of CRM, and they raised them up a level, if you like, and they've turned them into separate products, which is very smart because it means you now have this basic version of Power Platform, which is a nice, easy thing to work with. And it sits on top of something called the Dataverse, which broadly speaking is a database, but I think I'd be underselling it if I said it was just a database. There's all sorts of security stuff and things that are built into it, hopefully to make it easier to work with. So does Business Central sit on top of that?
Well, it integrates with Dataverse very, very easily using
right.
Like as I read your blog recently. Very good.
Very good.
It was a blog based around Power Automate and how Power Automate can, integrate with BC and how you do that with best practice. Use the managed solutions and make sure you don't disturb the unmanaged layers and the managed layers.
Yeah, which is very important within Dataverse. Yeah, absolutely.
What led you to make that blog?
I think it's a means of sometimes just recording stuff that you don't find elsewhere on the internet. So, I mean, obviously, there's a huge community, and I think we're going to talk a little bit later about community. And so there's lots of information, but sometimes it happens in a little bit of a piecemeal way. And so you might find half an answer here and half an answer there. And I could just write a blog and go, half the answers here, half the answers there. But sometimes I think it's easy to pull it all together and go, here's one blog, and you can just go straight through. I think it's important to reference all the other blogs, and particularly referencing the Microsoft Learn site, which has come on leaps and bounds over the last few years. It It used to be very much a clunky old thing, and now it's really quite powerful and a really useful learning tool.
I mean, talking about Microsoft Learn, I've used it myself getting into the industry.
Great.
It was very useful. I did 2 exams before I joined FormusPro.
Right.
Being the MB920, as I wanted to be a BC consultant, but I also thought it's important as a BC consultant to know the Power Platform.
Definitely.
So the PR900 too. Have you done any certifications yourself?
Yeah, so I did back in 2009. I'm not even sure what its code is anymore. So it's a Dynamics developer. So Dynamics back in the time was mostly all about plugins and asynchronous workflows. And then the history since has come on, and now the main workflow engine really has become Power Automate, particularly over the last 5 years. And so I recently passed PL 600, which is a Power Platform Solution Architect exam. But I've got some other bits and pieces to do in order to fulfill the entirety of the certification. So a little bit more exam stuff. Very useful to try and keep that, I think. And, it always looks good on a CV.
I'd like to know, you mentioned you have 15 years experience in the space. It'd be lovely to know how you got into, you're talking about CVs and that kind of thing. How did you originally get into Power Platform and this community?
Well, it's so I did a degree in electrical engineering and electronics, and I soon discovered that I was lousy at the electronic side of things. So, however, there's a lot of software involved, and it was would have been bits of C and Pascal, which is another very similar to Java and C# these days. I started work with a company called EDS, Electronic Data Systems, and I started off in Visual Basic. And Visual Basic, very similar to Power Platform in a lot of ways, in the way that it's grown over time. It went from quite a simple little product, from VB3, which is sort of circa 94. And by the time sort of 1998, 99, it'd grown into a product called VB6. And there was huge amounts of componentization and things like that. And we'll talk about componentization within the Power Platform, which is a relatively new thing. But it became obvious that the web was starting to gain strength, and the scripting language used in classic websites was ASP, was a form of Visual Basic. So it became very easy just to jump ship from one of those into another. And then I landed in a job. We ended up moving a lot of stuff over to .NET. Microsoft shifted to .NET, and VB became a little bit of a joke to an extent. That's probably a bit harsh. Visual Basic, everybody moved towards C#, certainly within a lot of the financial industries I was working in at the time. And then I moved into another financial organization, and they said, this was about 2009, and they said, well, we really need someone to do a little bit of KYC, know your customer, which is a big thing, and particularly after the sort of the crash of 2008, there was a lot of new regulations for the financial authorities and things were putting onto companies. So CRM seemed a very obvious thing to build into your system. And so, of course, at the time, it was a product that you had to install on a web server, and any customizations you would do were all basically .NET for plugins and JSON, and which I'd already done with a lot of website stuff. And so I kind of fell into it. They said, Phil, do you want to do a Dynamics course? And I said, great. And it was in Bath, and I was working in London. And so I had a couple of days in Bath, which was great. And they squished a 4-day course into 2.5 days, and I passed the exam quite quickly after that. And then I kind of got stuck in CRM and then Power Platform ever since. There's a lot from that 2009 exam that still stands me in very good stead, a lot of the underlying bits and pieces. So yeah, I fell into it, I think, is the short answer. But it's also, because it's such a big product, I don't know if this is the same with BC, you've got all of this stuff around the edge, and it's always there and changing and growing. And it means that, you can build up, the central part of your system quite quickly and quite easily with configuration. And then you can quite enjoy some of the more exciting things sometimes around the outside edge. What I didn't mention, of course, was in 1995, before I started work, I did an MSc in artificial intelligence. And that started probably in part of my electrical engineering degree. I did inverse kinematics using neural networks. And that's about teaching robots which direction to point their arm. Because if you think about a robot with, say, 6 points of articulation that's underwater trying to pick up something from the Titanic, if you want to say to it, okay, I need your arm to go that way, and it's got to avoid a hole over here, then the computation involved in that, and particularly in 1995, the processor involved, took quite a bit of effort, and so they were quite slow. So a professor had this great idea, what about we teach a neural network how to do it instead? Because basically it's all about patterns. And so I ended up doing a degree, my degree thing was training neural networks the whole time, and then charting how close they got depending upon how much you manipulated the data or encoded the data and things like that. And then I went and did this MSc in artificial intelligence at Cranfield University, and also ended up in doing a lot more neural network stuff, which was about, I wanted to teach an intelligent agent. And what I wanted to do was take a load of data from a financial system and basically try and train it so I could read the stock market or something like that. I couldn't get hold of any of the data because no one wanted to give a student any of this information. So I ended up sort of making up a certain amount of data in order to try and build up the idea of, if I could teach a neural network, could I then get the rules out of that neural network and potentially build a knowledge-based system out of it? And so it starts to look about stuff which is still interesting today in the artificial intelligence space. If you've got a neural network, which is basically a whole bunch of these nodes full of little lots of numbers, each one calculating directions and how data should flow. If you've got that, how do you then turn that into something that you can explain to somebody the reason it made the decision? And if you look at a large language model in AI these days, it's made up of, it may have 20,000, 30,000 inputs. And these are all encoded inputs. And you're trying to work out how does it come up with the answer it comes up with at the end. So, yeah, all interesting stuff, really.
Sounds the large language model, obviously Copilot.
Copilot, yeah.
Very big thing now. We use it in BC.
You do, great. What do you use it for in BC?
In BC currently, it's a very limited use.
Right.
Obviously, not many financial guys like trusting their data with.
It comes back to this trust, I think, with AI a lot, doesn't it?
It's very, very early on in the product's life cycle. As we know, Power Automate a few years ago wasn't massively used, and now it seems to be an everyday task for a lot of consultants I speak to.
Yeah.
You mentioned previously about CE, involving you have fun with the main structure of the product, and then there's these bits on the outside. Reminded me a lot of BC, where you start with the finance for a company. It's the driver for a lot of companies, get the finance working, and then we can go to the supply chain and the manufacturing and how goods come in and out and how you track that.
Yeah.
With serial number tracking and that kind of thing. So I was interested. Do you ever do? Because I know a lot of customers will use CE and then try and do these abstract ideas that BC probably would be more fit for. Do you ever do like customizations that are?
We do. I guess the thing with our customizations is they're fairly broad in terms of what you can do. So, if you can conceptualize it within a data model, then you can put it together in Dynamics. Whereas in Business Central, how does that work?
So we're sat on Azure. It's a SQL database. So it's a little bit different to how you use Dataverse and that side of things. A lot of our data comes through CSV files. So we'll come from a system, let's say like Sage, and then we'll put it all in CSV files, all their data in CSV files, and we'll work closely with them to cleanse that data, because as you probably experience, I imagine, the data sometimes, they've got years-old data, and it's not very useful a lot of the time.
Years-old data.
Yeah, so you have to cleanse that data, work with them, make sure you get rid of anything that's not relevant. So recently, great example, we're working with an aerospace company currently, and they've got bombs and routings that
bombs and routings. They go bang, do they? No, no, I don't think so.
So a bomb, you get. Let's imagine it's a book, for example.
Right.
Your end product. So it's a very hierarchical. How do you say the word?
Hierarchical
structure. So it's like a pyramid. Let's imagine.
Yes.
Right, at the bottom, you've got your paper. In the middle, you've got some ink to go on that paper, and then at the top, you've got your newspaper.
Right.
Right. So a BOM is very much that structure.
A bill of materials.
Bill of materials, exactly. And then the routing is how that pyramid aligns to each other, how one connects to another.
Okay.
And in that routing, you can add work centers, which is like a warehouse where
that would
take.
So if we were building a car or something, would it be like wheels at the bottom or rubber at the bottom?
Well, I'm not exactly sure how a car is assembled, but yeah, let's make up a
car. We can build a car, you and me, I reckon.
So a work center that you would use in your routing would be your warehouse.
Yeah.
So let's say warehouse A. Then you're right. You start with tires at the bottom, and then a chassis on top.
Right.
And then an engine on your third layer. Right. And your fourth layer would be windows. Fifth layer paint. Again, it's probably the wrong way to assemble a car. But in Phil and Charlie Land, this is how a car would be assembled. Right.
Like a clown car. You get in and it would fall apart. My bill of materials. We were missing a layer somewhere, weren't we?
Yeah, definitely something we've missed out. So lots of data comes across into BC. So I think there was 15,000 bombs that we've transferred. So as you can imagine, you have to work very closely with the client to make sure they're all relevant. There's no retired products that they've got rid of.
Yeah, of course.
Because you don't want redundant data. It costs money to store data, and
it does.
As a business grows, so does their data. A lot of forecasts based on reports and how you do that. And I know in CE you guys use Power BI.
We do. We use a number of reporting tools over in CE land. Really, so we have historical SQL Server reporting service reports, which I think are just referred to as kind of classic reports these days. And they work great against Dynamics data, in the Dataverse very easily. And you can wire them up to other connections and things like that. But I think these days there's been a push over recent years towards Power BI. I think Microsoft anything with power in the title suddenly becomes part of the Power Platform.
Power Automate.
Yeah, Power Automate, Power Platform, power this, power that. And we certainly Power BI hasn't yet fitted in. I think licensing has become a bit of an issue sometimes in that area, the cost. We work with FormusPro with a lot of not-for-profits, and so if you suddenly come across and go, well, we can give you these reports, but if you want these ones with a nice map on them or something, it's suddenly going to be £15 a head extra for all of you to use this report. Then it doesn't go down so well. It's one of those, a cost is a big issue within IT, like you mentioned in terms of that storage and stuff. It's not always straightforward for us to get right, particularly when you're having that conversation with a customer.
Yeah, I was going to say, as a technical architect, I know when I've worked in pre-sales, in the brief experience I have had in pre-sales and sales in general, like you say, licensing is a fixed cost for a lot of these companies, and they don't want to keep adding these fixed costs. And as you know, these licensing costs just seem to increase each year.
They do seem to go up, and sometimes they shift, and sometimes they can work in the customer's favour. But I remember an example of what's now called Power Pages, is portals. And originally they were kind of flat fee, £500 a month for this website. And then, so I put together a website for a customer of ours. And then 3 months later, the licensing changed and it became £1,500 a month. And the customer turned around, of course, to us and they go, what's going on? And you're like, and it was a bolt out of the blue. And it's been a bit of a contentious thing for many of our customers who's wanted to use portals. Lucky, I say that there's no luck in it at all. We have technical people who are able to put together portals that don't have the same licensing costs. But I guess that's not all organizations can do that kind of work. So it's important for us to do.
I'd say on the C side, on the BC side, we have you have an essentials license and a team member license. That's the main two we use predominantly. And your team member licenses, I don't know the exact cost, but it's very cheap. It's like £4 or £5 a month.
Right, that is very good. It's
very cheap. But then your essentials license is like £60 a month, or
again, not
exact figures, but it's a vast jump between them. I know when I've done the MB230 and the MB210, it speaks about licensing a lot in those exams.
Yeah.
And you guys have a lot more licenses, right?
We do. So we have the Power Platform license, effectively for most per users. And then you have a number of licenses you can have per app. Then we have licenses per flow. So these Power Automate things, when they're doing jobs where they've got to dish out information, for example, we did one where we were talking to a portal API and it wasn't a Dynamics portal. We still needed to cover ourselves, and we couldn't use a per user license because that's £15, whereas the flow license is closer to £150. However, it was covering off 3 sets of data. And I think sometimes people treat licensing as if it's a game where you're trying to get as much out of Microsoft as you possibly can. Whereas my feeling towards it more is that, Microsoft has spent a lot of money putting stuff into Azure, taking the platform forwards and all this kind of stuff. And that I try not to ever cheat the system and go, okay, well, I could use a team license here, but they're not really a team person. There's something else. And the team license is another cheaper form of licensing. So I do try and, I think, play fair. And I know, I'm sure you probably take a sort of similar approach with BC.
Well, very much so. So on the Microsoft side, I agree. That in order for them to progress the app, and to progress the community and the whole industry as a standard, in as one product, they need to make money, right?
Yeah.
So it's a business at the end of the day.
Yeah.
The one thing we normally try and cut costs on are these reporting tools. So like Jet Reports is one we use in BC.
Yeah.
I think it's £1,500 a year
for
5 viewer licenses and 1 designer license, right? So
okay.
Again, that's like a standard foundation package. If the client doesn't need more than that, we often won't tend to.
Yeah, absolutely.
You never try and sell them what they don't need, right?
Absolutely. So I've been in consultancy prior to FormusPro, and one of the jobs where I didn't last very long was because we used to have a guy who did sales, and his thing was we always go in cheap and we undercut everybody, and then when the client asks any changes, that's where we make our money. And again, it's that whole thing about playing fair, right? For me, consultancy is very much about always, I think, you get in, you do the job, you make yourself, you work yourself out of a job, essentially. You give the client what they want and they deliver. And I think things like the Power Platform and Dynamics in, sort of across the whole sphere, is about being able to deliver, other words, about being able to deliver and deliver quickly and at a fair, reasonable cost. And I think that's, it's a two-way street, right?
Well, 100%. I mean, we need to make money as a business in order to be paid and, live our lives.
Yeah.
That'd be right. As you say, we work for a lot of non-profits, and, you don't want to rip these clients off at the end of the day. They're doing good for the world.
Absolutely.
And they're the ones you really want to help. Absolutely. Microsoft, on the BC side, anyway, I'm sure it's replicated on the C side. Microsoft for licensing have 75% discount.
Wow. Yeah. And I think that's great, right, that they do things like that. I know we've got a couple of upcoming talks that we're doing with some of our not-for-profit customers where, Microsoft are stepping in and they're talking about the licensing costs. And, engaging those customers and letting them realize that, they're getting this fantastic piece of software at a pretty good cost. So,
yeah. Previously, you mentioned integration with other data sources. Is that something you often do in CE? I'd
say 80% of projects nearly always end up with some level of integration. And that's that. I think that's the fun part of a system, is where you end up going, okay, so somebody thinks about a product, for example, in these terms. How can I represent that in Dataverse? And is there another system I need to talk to? And I think that's where the fun comes in. And you can go, okay, and you start doing the modeling work and building up a picture in your head of, okay, how does a customer, what language do they use? How do they talk about things? And I think it's a big part of solution architecture, is being able to learn the customer's language and speak to them in their terms, but also introduce the fact, they've got these other ideas that they need to take on as well. I think software development I said it's a two-way street earlier. A product at the end of the day ends up belonging to an organization, and it's really important that they take on part of that ownership. And I think our jobs as consultants is to guide them towards that point where they can stand on their own 2 feet. So do customers, when they're doing, sort of Business Central, Charlie, do they tend to pick stuff up like that, or do you find yourselves managing stuff for them?
Well, we often, I think the word negate is wrong, right? I was going to say we try and negate other options. We want Business Central to be the hub of the data, really.
Right.
And you do, because Business Central is very much about compliance and regulation.
Right.
If you transacted against a GL code, you can't then edit that GL code, right? Because you've got to stay compliant with your VAT returns and that kind of reporting based on your location. And Business Central has these localizations, they're called,
right,
for different regions. So we've got one in the UK. There's not one currently for Portugal. So we've had to work with another partner recently quite closely to make sure that our customer could have a Portuguese localization, which ended up just being an extension onto another production environment within the BC environment, or within the BC tenant, I should say.
Right.
There's a localization rather than an extension rather than a localization.
Okay.
And we often try and, if we're using other localizations, we often try and stay as the hub of data, because as you know, when you're using multiple data sources, it can get very confusing trying to make sure they all stay, especially if you're trying to say regulatory in all of these places.
That's it, because I guess on the CE side of things, again, we want to become one source of truth, and I think that's essential for any organization. But a lot that comes along with that is, I think sometimes there's a historical viewpoint that maybe that's sort of, it's not scalable enough, and there's basically, I don't think there's a computer system alive today that you couldn't probably throw 1,000 people at it and it would shrug it off, because processing power over the last few years has become so cheap and so easy. Whereas I guess for Business Central, you want to become that one source of truth, but then you're also, we allow a lot of data to be changed and modified, and we can audit it, but there's something different on your side. You mentioned a lot more control.
Yeah, I mean, Business Central is very much about is about the control and the regulatory side of it.
Right.
You can't report VAT returns if they've been edited, because it wouldn't be
right.
Wouldn't be financially.
So in CE, acceptable. There are chances, if you're a system administrator, unless you put a lot of stuff in place, there is always a chance potentially you could modify data. Now, obviously, you can come along and we can move data around into certain business units, I guess, within our organizations or environments to prevent that. But if you're a sysadmin, you could do that. So is there not like a sysadmin that can modify these things on your side?
So there is very much user groups, and that's changing more to the Azure side now,
right.
More recently than it has done before. But even as a sysadmin, or we have roles in BC which hides what you can therefore see.
Yeah.
And there's role centers, and you can modify each page and how each person, because there's lots of things on as you can imagine, BC is a product that caters for all, right? And then you have to configure it as a consultant to how that business needs it and the business requirements.
Okay.
And these role centers are a perfect way to do that. So, if you're only doing finance, there'd be no need for your accountant role to have any visual sight of anything to do with manufacturing, right? Because it's just not relevant to your business.
Okay.
So it's like, why see it? So it just hides that from that person.
Yeah.
And I just don't understand, from a C point of view, why it isn't more controlled and isn't more regulatory. Well,
that's it. We have security roles, but a system administrator has a view across the entire system. Now you're always, I think, probably going to need some level of system administrator access. And I suppose you can restrict that, within your production environment. And you can release through, instead of you don't need to release through the UI or anything like that. So when I talk about releases, I'm talking about solutions. So all of the customizations you change. Say you want to change the field length of someone's name from 20 characters to 30 characters. And you move that with this solution, you apply it to your UAT environment or whichever environment, any other environments, and then finally it lands in your production environment. And, it's all about, we can do that, and we do tend to do that an awful lot with customers, is we automate that process. so that it's easier for us, it involves less people, and it can be tracked and authorized. And we take the components apart and we would put those into source control and things like that, so that we know exactly what's where. And so if somebody says, I have an issue with my production environment, I can nearly always just go straight back into a development environment and reproduce that, because the level of component changes are the same across these environments. And it's been a big thing in CE and Power Platform even, that it's been quite freewheeling for a number of years. Traditionally, Microsoft allowed for the release of unmanaged components, and that meant once you installed the solution with its field changes, once it went in, it just became part of this large mush of changes. But over the years, Microsoft have pushed back, and we now have these layers of customizations. And once they go in, they're pretty much fixed altogether. So if I want to remove them, I can't just go in and pick one, modify anything there. I then can actually say, okay, I want to remove this particular item out. And that's a big thing. And certainly it's caused a certain amount of contention within the community over the years, as Microsoft kind of flip-flopped initially, and then they've gone quite hard with this thing. And certainly I used to sit on the fence a little bit, because there are times when it's just a mush that it's much easier to come along and do what you want. But I think, over the last few years, I've definitely landed on the side of that control is much better. So what happens on the Business Central side? How do you have development environments and UAT environments and all that kind of stuff? How does that work?
Very much so. So we still have the, as you guys do, your dev, your UAT, and your prod. Mm-hmm. Prod being production. And then within that, we'll just create companies. So like maybe test company 1, test company 2.
Right.
Where you'll just key in some data that's fairly relevant to the business, so you can test accurately.
Right.
And then we use AL code. I don't know what do you use to develop in C?
Well, configuration is done in a number of different ways. So we have our metadata where we build up tables and business rules and things like that. And then more recently, we've got something called Power FX, which is a kind of Excel-like code. The codes become, with Power Automate, the whole idea of dragging and dropping stuff onto a workflow designer. I think there came this push that once you did that, you'd get rid of code forever. But I don't think it seems to have, over the last few years, switched back again to doing code. So we now have Power FX, we have Power FX low-code plugins, which have been in preview forever and ever. We have plugins that you can write in C# or VB.NET or a number of different .NET. They run in .NET. We also have workflows and things. And under the hood, I think traditionally they're made up of bits of classic Windows workflow foundation and things like that. So yeah, we've got a lot more historical configuration stuff going on than you guys, I think.
It's funny you say that there's a push for low code, because on the VC side, any development work is always code, right? You get the developers in, get the AL code, now the table extension or add fields that way. There's not particularly, I don't think there's any way to customize VC other than obviously there's a personalized tab, so you can hit the settings or the cog on the top right hand side, and you can personalize your table with fields that might not show. As I said previously, you can edit that on the role center and edit your pages, and you can add fields in or take fields out. So if you're a company that, again, like I said, if you transact GL codes, for example, and not items, then there's no reason for you to have like location codes, because you're not storing anything, right? So you can just remove that from the field, and they don't need to see it. So you can personalize the tables and the pages in which you see to be what you need. But any development, if you wanted to add a field that isn't there out the box, it'll all be code. Not to say it's not a simple change. But therefore, you would need a developer to do any.
So they actually have to, some kind of SQL type language or something like that to create a field.
It's AL code. It's its own language for VC. It's very, very distinct. I know it's double negative. I've done some work with some developers at FormusPro. Not to say I'm an expert at it by
No.
any means, but yeah, so it's an interesting way to customize pages actually.
Yeah. Whereas we have, we've always had these kind of form editors. So you can come along and go, new field of type whatever, and then you can then start adding these fields onto forms, and then you can start referencing them with workflows and things like that. So yeah, quite different in that respect.
It's interesting you mentioned workflows. I've recently been playing with some workflows. Again, another element of control almost in BC where say you're raising a purchase order for something over £50,000, you might go as a project manager or a finance manager. I don't really trust this. This person's only been here a year.
Right.
If they've only been here a year, I don't want them to approve anything other than above £50,000.
Okay.
It's a lot of money to a lot of businesses, right? So you can just do a workflow to say if this person's only been here for this user, or you can just do it as purchase orders in general almost.
Okay.
And go, if the purchase order is over £50,000, and you can add all your conditions and then your response to those conditions.
Okay.
In BC, how do workflows work in CE? Is it similar or?
It's very similar enough. We've got a number of choices of how you can go about modifying these things. So we have Power Automate, of course, which would be probably most people's go-to, which is an asynchronous workflow. So it doesn't happen immediately, where we have real-time workflows, which happen. So if you click on something, they happen instantly. I think we have classic asynchronous workflows, which are still kicking around, but I think are probably going to die a death soon, as Power Automate can sort of take over them. And then we've got little bits of code, of course, that you can write, which can also do these things. So we have plugins. So every time you do something in CE, every time you create, read, update, delete, then a message is triggered inside the system, and you can hook into that message, and you can say, okay, before this message happens, so before you write to a database, for example, we can run a piece of code. So you might choose to do an integration or something like that. And then the actual CE stuff, Dynamics, will write to a database and things will happen. So that's a big important part of CE development, is understanding this underlying model in terms of these messages and how they operate. So do you guys do anything like that on your side?
Well, in BC, say you add a field to a form, for example, as you said, form editing. Say you add a field to a sales order, for example.
Right.
Let's pick a field that already exists, like your reference or your purchase order number.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that already exists. So when you go to write a Power Automate flow, because you can do workflows in BC in Power Automate, and that is, I think, slowly where it's shifting towards. I think, as you said previously, I think the workflows side of things is going to die out the more BC or the more Power Automate can do in BC and CE therefore. And I think at the moment it's not great. So if you use a Power Automate BC connector in BC, if you built a custom field using AL code, it won't appear on that.
Oh, does it not?
Whereas in C, I know from the experience I have, it does. If you create a field, it will show in your
once you publish it, then it's going to be available. Certainly.
Whereas we have to build an API as an extension within BC to show Power Automate that field.
Wow.
Which creates a bit more complexity.
It does, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Especially as a solution architect or that type of role, you have to always consider these things when you're building your solutions.
Absolutely.
As it's going to be more work than maybe just a workflow. But then moving forward in that product, is a workflow going to be there forever? Or if they do a Power Automate flow, is that going to last longer term than your workflow?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting conundrum, right?
Yeah. And I think, it's a big part of knowing your system and knowing the direction that it's going to take, or assuming the direction it's going to take. And I think, like I mentioned, these plugins, which have been in preview forever, everyone's been quite excited about them, and yet they've taken a long time to get to a point where I think they're worthy of a release. So it'd be interesting to see how they get on, really.
It's interesting you mentioned those. I saw one of my good friends, AJ Zafar.
Yeah, AJ.
I know
AJ.
Everyone knows AJ.
Everyone.
He did a demo
He did
at Dynamic Minds,
right?
With low-code plugins, and it's interesting because you can't edit them, can you? Once
it seems strange that they've been implemented in such a way that and they've been around for about a year. People have been talking about these things, maybe even 18 months at this point. And I've always been very surprised how they've come forwards and then they seem to have stopped. But I do see an awful lot of excitement about low-code plugins. I suppose it's always interesting that Microsoft choose to go with the concept of low-code, with the idea that I think anybody can come along and pick it up, the citizen developer idea, which personally I beware, sort of people playing in your system. I guess, I would treat most citizen developers' work as prototype or proof of concept potentially, and then I would choose to absorb it. And we can do stuff within our environments to encourage that. Do you have citizen developers on the Business Central side?
I wouldn't imagine. I haven't met any citizen developers yet, due to it being a unique language just to BC. Therefore, like, as in a sit dev on your side might not need to know much code, whereas on our side they'd have to learn the whole language to be able to add, simple things like a table extension or, I mean, don't get me wrong. There's if you could class a sit dev as someone that's changed a bit of configuration to fit how the business is, changed over time, then maybe there are, I know a few people that have configured BC differently to how we've set it up for them 2 years down the line, because the business has changed where it's aiming to be. But I'm not sure if I'd class that as a developer of any sorts.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of these levels. I would sometimes a little bit rudely maybe refer to functional developers as funkies, because they never they will go, well, I think that's code, Phil, so that's got to be your department. And I'd be like, well, actually, you probably could do it if you do something a bit cleverer with your workflow, or I give you a little something that you can use in your workflow. Because I think it's really important to make sure that functional consultants who are not quite, will often say, I'm not a developer, but then they're the first person to sit down and try and bang out some PowerFX. I think it's important to ensure that they are along for the ride. For me, it's very much all systems. You need to ensure that everybody within the team can work with it. And there's bits and pieces you can do with that. Recent products changes. The idea of a custom connector is something within the Power Platform. So I can, once I've got an API, I can import that into the system, and then I can use it within Power Automate. And the API might hide a lot of the complexity, but hopefully a functional consultant can still see the outcome of what has happened with the API, and I think that's important. So, and I guess custom connectors are probably something, because it's in Power Automate, it's something you guys could start implementing on the Business Central side.
Very much so. It probably is in a lot of projects, right? Like I said, we try and keep BC as the main data source. Don't get me wrong, we've worked closely with clients recently that are in the food and beverage industry, where they sort out restaurants to go and serve nursing homes and schools and that kind of industry in multiple countries. And we've worked with them quite well to integrate. They use a reporting software called Indicator. That's the first time we've ever used it ourselves. So that's been an interesting experience learning these softwares for the first time. And it's a German company. I think it's a German company. So working with their support team has been, bilingual has been interesting.
I mean, historically, I've always found the Germans have been great to work with. When I started work at EDS, it was working at EDS, Electronic Data Systems. We used to call it Everyday Sucked, or Everyone Dresses the Same. It was a great organisation to work for, really. So then we worked with Rank Xerox, which is now Xerox, and we would do a lot of software, and it was all Visual Basic, and there was services doing screen scraping from mainframes and stuff at the time, because the mainframes weren't going, and probably still in use, some of them. These things are like 50 years old and still going. But we'd take that data, and everybody else in Europe would take on board this software without a problem. The Dutch and everybody else, no problem. The Spanish, the Portuguese. When it came to France and Germany, has to be translated. So I remember very clearly, us going to France, and this is probably 25 years ago. I missed the first flight to Paris because we were part of the EU. So I took along my driver's license and went, "So a driving license, this is valid EU ID." And they went, "No, we want to see a passport." Luckily enough, I lived close enough to Heathrow that I went home within about 20 minutes, picked up my passport, came back, and then I was still in France in time for, sort of lunchtime, which back in the day meant going down to a lovely big canteen. The food was amazing. And of course, EDS was an American firm, and a guy called Ross Perot used to own it, and before it got bought by General Motors. But at the time, I think there was a strict no drinking at lunchtime rule, which was very difficult because in Xerox, you'd go to play snooker in their social club, and or you could tell who was EDS and who wasn't EDS, because the EDS guys weren't drinking and looking sad, and the ranked Xerox guys were drinking. And anyway, we'd end up, sort of in this French job, working very closely with this fantastic French team. But I always remember going, great, wine at lunchtime. And then sort of, there were no meetings until at least 2:00 then. So a lot of fun.
I'm not sure if it's bad that what I take from that story is that you tried to leave the country without a passport.
Leave the country without a passport.
I'm not sure how it went back in your day, Phil, but since I've been leaving the country, I've always
taken your passport.
Yeah.
Well, it was a learning lesson for sure. But
was that on the train or a plane?
It was on a plane, and I remember being quite excited because I think I flew British Airways, and I can't remember the last time I flew on British Airways because normally I can't afford it, and most companies I refuse to pay for very expensive flights. And I think it was the drummer from what's his name? There's we could clap and record and stop this for a second while we Google it, but maybe someone on that side of the camera will remember. Are you going to go my way? No.
Excuse Phil.
No, that's
awful.
But anyway,
Lenny Kravitz.
Lenny Kravitz's drummer was on the plane. So, and I remember sort of, and it was an almost quiet flight because, of course, I'd missed the busy flight and I'd ended up on a quieter flight later in the day. I mean, I say later in the day, it was like probably 9:00 as opposed to 8:00 or something like that.
Do you fly often as a consultant to site?
Not anymore. No, I mean, obviously, since 2019, things, travel sort of has fallen off to almost nothing. I think it's building back up. I think you see a lot more customers probably starting to request people to be on site. But sort of up until then, I remember the first job I worked with one of the guys who works at FormusPro, a guy called Glenn. We were all on site, sort of 5 days a week on a customer site in London. And then a couple of 18 months later on another job, they wanted 3 days a week minimum, Tuesday through to Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And sometimes if there were other meetings, they'd say come in on a Monday and a Friday. Whereas that dropped off obviously in a huge way, post-COVID. But I have the suspicion that a lot of organizations, they seem to be pushing back on it now. I guess IT, do we need to be on site? I'd argue probably not a lot of the time because we're expensive, and if you're going to pay for us to get there and all the rest of it. So it'd be interesting to see how that goes. What about your customers? Are they very much meet once and that's it?
We find at the start of most projects, they want you on site, they want to say hello. It's good to put a name to a face, I think.
Absolutely. I think that's really important.
It's an essential part, as a consultant, you've got to be trusted and you've got to feel secure with what you say a lot, a lot of the time. At the end of the day, they're consulting you, but you're consulting them. So a lot of time we always try and go on site to start a project. You normally find when it comes towards 75% of the way through and you're starting to train users and the wider company on how to use the system effectively, and you always find doing that remotely doesn't have the same.
No, I think it's much easier. Yeah, to look someone in the eye, isn't it, and go, yeah, okay, and believe what they say.
That's it. And we've found previously, where we've worked closely with clients to build full manufacturing systems, where you've had their, program leads, do things and their senior staff tell you what they want built and all their processes. You then, when you go on site to that training, you speak to some of their workers and they go, oh, where's this bit? Or, where's this process that you follow? And little things like that you'll miss out if you don't work closely with them on site sometimes. And I think it's an essential part of making sure you cover the whole 360 of their business, is that you go on site and actually monitor what the people on the ground do, and the people that are going to use the system, how you can effectively enhance and make their day easier effectively.
That's what it's all about, isn't it? I think it comes round back to what we were saying earlier. It's about delivering and about making sure that basically you're no longer needed, and that involves training up super users and the like, and getting them to take ownership of the system and to love their system, which I think is really important. Really important.
I think, as you say, to use their system, I think user adoption is one of the hardest things to grasp in some systems, and easiest in others. But as a consultant for us, it is, as UAT is, where users have to test is. They might tell you it's done, but often, it might not be as clinical as you'd hope.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that you end up having to do the trade-off of, okay, how much do I need to tell you to test, and how much do you assume to test, and can this do your day-to-day job? Because I'm sure in some companies I've been in, and they've said yes, we've tested it, and you've maybe looked at the data and gone, okay, they've done something with it. And they say, we're good to go live, and then they'll go live, and then they'll say, oh, I don't like the way it does this. And you'd be like, well, hang on, you told me that you tested it. And then you discover that only one of them out of a group of 10 has actually done all the testing or something like that. So it's something, experience tells me that's the kind of stuff you have to look out for. And again, it comes back to this. It's much easier to do this stuff if you're actually with somebody and they go, this is how I do it. During the consultants period, sometimes you get, you speak to a super user or a product owner, and you don't always get the full truth, I've discovered. Sometimes you do need to dig deeper, and it's important to be able to go in and see someone using the system, someone who actually does use the system. And they sometimes have a very different story to tell than the product owner may have.
100%. I think that just about wraps it up. It's been lovely to
Absolutely. Let's look forward to the next one.
Catch up with you in a few weeks to see what you've been up to.
All right, excellent. I'll look forward to it.